I remember the night so vividly it still lingers in my chest like a dull ache. The dining room glowed with candles, the air heavy with the scent of rosemary and lemon. The table stretched long and beautiful, covered with linen I had ironed earlier that day, each wine glass polished until it shone like crystal under the soft light. Guests had gathered, their voices rising and falling in waves of laughter. From the kitchen, I could hear the joy spilling over, wrapping around every corner of the house. My house. Or at least, it used to feel like mine. That afternoon had been spent entirely in the kitchen. I had chopped onions until my eyes watered, marinated chicken until the herbs seeped into my skin, roasted potatoes, and simmered vegetables until the flavors blended perfectly. My hands were red from hot water, my shoulders sore from leaning over the counter. Cooking had always been a language of love for me. Every slice, every stir was meant to say you are cared for, you are safe here, you belong. That was the language I had spoken to my son his entire life. But now the words seemed to vanish into steam rising from the pots, unacknowledged and unnoticed. When I finally brought the food out, balancing heavy platters against my hip, the dining room erupted with delight. Everyone's eyes lit up at the sight of the meal. Everyone except mine. I set the dishes down carefully, smiling politely, though my throat was tight. Daniel, my son, was already mid-conversation with one of his friends, his hand wrapped around a glass of wine. Sophie, his wife, moved gracefully between guests, topping off glasses, snapping a quick photo of the table for her online followers. No one gestured for me to sit. No one pulled out a chair. There was not even a pause in their conversation to say thank you. I hovered there for a heartbeat too long, waiting for an invitation that never came. Then I retreated to the kitchen, the sound of laughter chasing me down the hallway. From the doorway I could still see them, my own sons seated at the head of the table, Sophie beside him, their friends leaning in close, their smiles wide and careless. It looked like a perfect picture, the kind people post to capture what happiness is supposed to look like. But it was not my picture. I was not in it. I picked at the scraps left in the roasting pan, a cold piece of chicken, a spoonful of potatoes, chewing without tasting. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above me, a lonely sound against the symphony of voices in the next room. I kept wiping down the counters, though there was nothing left to clean. I filled water glasses no one asked for. I stayed busy because the alternative was standing still, and standing still meant feeling the emptiness pressing in from every side. Once, this table had been ours. Once, Daniel had sat there with school books spread wide, asking me for help with math problems. Once, his laughter had filled the space with a sound that was only for me. I could still see him in my mind, 8 years old, gap-toothed and eager, holding a crayon in his hand while I sketched designs for a house project. He used to tell me, "Mama, I will build something beautiful with you one day." And I believed him. Now he sat at that same table, but the boy I raised was gone. In his place was a man who barely glanced my way, who let me hover like a servant while he toasted to his own life. The sting of it burned hotter than the oven I had worked over all day. When the plates began to empty, I walked back into the dining room, collecting them silently. The guests leaned back in their chairs, full and content, laughing about plans for the weekend. I reached between their arms for glasses, lifted forks that clattered lightly against porcelain, and all the while they kept talking as though I were not there. My own son handed me his plate without meeting my eyes. Back in the kitchen, I rinsed the dishes one by one, the water running hot, steam fogging up my glasses. I scrubbed each fork, each spoon, each plate with mechanical precision, listening to their voices carry on. A joke sent them into fits of laughter, the sound echoing sharp in my ears. It was like listening to a party through a wall, except the wall was me. I kept my back to them, but inside, something was unraveling. When the guests finally left, Sophie's heels clicked against the floor as she walked them out, her voice high and cheerful, promising to meet again soon. Daniel's laughter followed, soft and warm, the way he once used to laugh with me. The front door closed, leaving the house suddenly quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, now they would notice me. Now Daniel would come into the kitchen, wrap an arm around my shoulders and say thank you, Mom, but he did not. Instead, I heard their footsteps retreat to the living room, their voices blending again, lower now private. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the last dirty pan, the smell of lemon still clinging to my skin. My reflection looked back at me in the window, tired and small, framed by the glow of the dining room light still burning bright behind me. I did not eat dinner that night. Not really. I ate scraps, cold and unwanted, and swallowed them like medicine. The house was quiet now, but the silence was not peace. It was heavy, suffocating. I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling slightly, and I knew something inside me had shifted. That night, long after the dishes had been washed and stacked neatly in the cupboard, I found myself still awake. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, yet the echoes of laughter from earlier clung to the walls like ghosts. I sat on the edge of the couch, the same couch I bought years ago when Daniel was just starting high school. Back then, he would sprawl across it with textbooks, his socks mismatched, his hair always falling into his eyes. I would sit at the other end, sipping tea, reminding him to finish his homework. Now that couch belonged to Sophie, or at least that is how she treated it. She had once complained that it looked old-fashioned, out of style. She wanted sleek leather, something modern and bright for the pictures she posted online. She had covered my couch with blankets in colors I never would have chosen, her scent of perfume clinging to the cushions. I sat there anyway, too tired to care, my body heavy and my mind restless. I stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines between the faint cracks in the plaster. My body was still tense from standing all evening, from moving silently around people who had not noticed me. The sound of their laughter replayed in my mind, sharp and unforgiving. I thought about the way Daniel had handed me his plate without even looking at me, the way Sophie had reached over my shoulder in the kitchen earlier, grabbing a glass without so much as a good evening. When had this become my life? I could not remember the exact moment it shifted, the day I went from being mother to maid, from the heart of the home to a silent figure in the background. Maybe it had been gradual, the way water wears down stone, one small moment after another until suddenly the person I had been no longer existed. I thought back to the day Daniel asked if he and Sophie could stay here. They had been struggling after the wedding, he said, his job uncertain, her projects unstable. I had welcomed them without hesitation. Stay as long as you need. I told them money should not be the thing that held them back. I had meant every word. At first it felt good. House was full again. I heard footsteps in the hallway, voices echoing up the stairs. I cooked dinners for us, imagining it would bring us closer. But slowly, piece by piece, my life had been packed away. The photographs I once displayed were replaced with Sophie's decorative frames. The shelves I organized with care were emptied to make space for her yoga mats and candles. Even the curtains I had chosen years ago were replaced with lighter fabric, because Sophie said the rooms needed more light for her videos. I let it happen. I told myself it was just stuff, just decoration. I told myself they needed to feel at home. I told myself it was only temporary. But the longer it went on, the more I began to disappear. Lying there on the couch, I could still hear faint murmurs from upstairs. Daniel and Sophie were talking softly, their voices carrying just enough to remind me that they were together, they belonged. I was the outsider in my own house. My chest tightened. I pressed a hand against my ribs as though I could hold myself together. I thought of all the nights I came home exhausted from work when Daniel was little, still managing to cook him dinner, still washing his clothes late into the night. I thought of the mornings I woke before dawn to pack his lunches, scribbling little notes to slip into his bag, telling him he could do anything. I had poured myself into raising him, and now here I was, unseen, unacknowledged, erased. The tears came slowly at first, sliding down my temples as I stared at the ceiling. I tried to swallow them back, tried to convince myself I was stronger than this, but the weight of it pressed harder. I curled onto my side, clutching a pillow to my chest. I whispered into the dark, though no one could hear me. When did I stop being your mother, Daniel? When did I become someone you could overlook? No answer came, just silence. I do not know how long I lay there, half crying, half staring at the faint shadows on the ceiling. Hours passed, the house settling into stillness. Finally, sometime after midnight, I sat up, my body stiff, my mind raw. I walked into the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tiles, and stared out the window into the backyard. The garden was still there, though neglected. The flower beds I had once cared for had weeds pushing through. The bird bath Daniel had picked out when he was a boy sat cracked and dry. I pressed my hand against the glass, remembering the afternoons we used to spend out there together, planting marigolds, chasing butterflies. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now, some other version of us. The moonlight caught on the edges of the counter, glinting off the clean dishes. I thought about tomorrow, about waking up early to cook breakfast for two people who would not thank me, who would not even notice me. I thought about the cycle of it, endless, suffocating. Something in me hardened. I pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shadows of my hands resting on the wood. I listened to the quiet hum of the appliances, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided. What if I stopped? What if I simply stepped away? The thought scared me, but it also lit a spark inside me. I did not have answers yet, only the fragile beginning of something that felt like freedom. By the time dawn began to lighten the edges of the sky, my decision had already started to form. I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of being useful but unloved. Something had to change. And though I did not know it then, that sleepless night was the first crack in the life I had built around everyone else. It was the night I finally admitted the truth. I could not keep living like this. The morning after that sleepless night arrived far too quickly. I had not really closed my eyes, just drifted in and out of shallow thoughts while the sky shifted from black to gray. By the time sunlight began to creep through the curtains, my body ached from lying still on the couch. My eyes felt heavy, yet inside me something sharp and awake pulsed with an energy I could not ignore. I moved slowly, careful not to wake anyone upstairs. The stairs creaked faintly above me, proof that Daniel and Sophie were still asleep, lost in the comfort of dreams. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, and made myself a cup of coffee. The bitterness filled my mouth, the warmth spreading through my hands as I held the mug tightly. I stared at the steam rising, thinking about how many mornings had started this exact same way. Me, in the kitchen before anyone else. Me, preparing the day for others. Me, making sure the house ran smoothly. But that morning was different. The idea that had crept into my thoughts during the night refused to leave. It sat there in my chest like a stone, heavy but undeniable. What if I stopped? What if I simply walked away? I looked around the kitchen, at the cabinet Sophie had insisted on repainting, at the neatly stacked glasses I had polished, at the counters scrubbed spotless by my own hands. Everything here had my touch in it, yet it no longer felt like mine. Even the walls, once warm with colors I had chosen, now gleamed in shades Sophie preferred for her videos. The truth pressed against me, forcing me to breathe differently. This was my house. My name was still on the deed. I had bought it with years of work, long days and longer nights, contracts signed with tired hands. And yet somehow, slowly, I had been pushed to the edges of it. I set the coffee down and walked upstairs, my steps soft on the carpet. In my room, I pulled the closet doors open. The scent of cedar drifted faintly from inside, mingling with dust. On the top shelf sat a small suitcase, the one I had not touched in years. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for it, pulling it down, the zipper catching for a moment before it gave way. Folding clothes into the suitcase felt surreal. I chose carefully, not much, just enough to get by. A few shirts, a sweater, a pair of jeans, the dress I had always loved but rarely wore. I tucked in my toothbrush, a small bottle of lotion, the pair of shoes that had molded to the shape of my feet from years of use. Then I paused. On the dresser sat a framed photograph. Daniel, 8 years old, standing on a beach, sand stuck to his knees, grinning at the camera with his front teeth missing. I picked it up and held it to my chest. The memory swelled inside me, bittersweet. That boy had once been my whole world. That boy had once clung to me, trusting me to be his anchor. I slipped the photo carefully into the suitcase. As I packed, my eyes landed on a folder tucked at the back of the closet. It was worn, edges bent, the papers inside thick with years of significance. My fingers brushed over it, hesitating. I knew what it was without opening it. Documents of ownership, the title of the house, still in my name. I pulled it out for just a moment, letting the weight of it settle into my hands. The bold letters of my name stared back at me, unshakable proof that this place belonged to me. A strange surge of both anger and relief rose in me. For all the ways I had been made to feel small here, for all the times I had been treated as though I was nothing more than a helper, the truth was undeniable. I still held the foundation beneath their feet. I pressed the folder shut and slid it into the suitcase, burying it under the clothes. My hands lingered there a second longer, my breath unsteady. That was when I realized I was not just leaving for a walk, not just escaping for a day. I was leaving for real. I did not write a note. I did not leave instructions. I had spent too many years explaining myself, softening my words, cushioning the truth so others would not feel discomfort. This time there would be no explanations. Only action. As the sun climbed higher, I zipped the suitcase, the sound slicing through the silence like a final decision. I carried it down the stairs slowly, careful not to wake them. My hand brushed the banister, the same one Daniel used to slide down as a child, laughing so hard he would collapse at the bottom. For a second my chest tightened, remembering that little boy, but I kept moving. I walked through the hallway, past the wall where his school photo still hung, his crooked tie and proud smile forever frozen in time. I touched the frame gently, then let my hand fall away. The front door felt heavier than it should have when I pulled it open. I paused on the threshold, suitcase at my side, staring at the morning light spilling across the porch. This house had been everything once. It had been my safety, my accomplishment, my love poured into wood and stone. But the people inside had made it a place I no longer recognized. I stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dew. The wheels of my suitcase rolled quietly against the pavement as I walked down the path, not looking back. My car waited at the curb, paint chipped but engine steady. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a moment. My hands rested on the steering wheel, trembling slightly. I expected tears, but none came. Instead, there was a strange calm, a steadiness I had not felt in years. I started the engine. The sound was louder than I expected in the morning stillness, but no one stirred. I drove away slowly, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror. By the time it disappeared completely, I knew something had shifted forever. That first night, I stayed at a small motel on the edge of town. The kind with scratchy blankets and a television mounted too high on the wall. I sat on the bed with my suitcase at my feet, staring at the silence around me. It was different from the silence in my house. This one was empty but freeing, no laughter cutting through it, no footsteps above my head, just me, alone with the sound of my own breathing. I reached for my phone, half expecting to see messages, but the screen was blank. No calls, no texts, not from Daniel, not from Sophie. I let the phone fall onto the bed. My chest tightened, but not from sadness, from clarity. For the first time in a long time, I was not invisible. I was simply alone. And alone, I could finally see myself again. The first night in the motel was unlike any night I had known before. The room smelled faintly of bleach and something older, something that no amount of cleaning could erase. The carpet was rough beneath my feet, the kind of industrial weave that hides stains but never really feels clean. The blanket on the bed was thin, scratchy against my skin, and the television hummed faintly even when it was off, its presence heavy in the corner. I sat at the edge of the mattress for a long time, staring at the plain walls. There were no family photos here, no decorations Sophie had chosen, no shelves filled with things that reminded me of who I once was. There was only me, my suitcase, and the quiet. At first, the silence was deafening. I kept waiting for footsteps in the hallway, for Daniel's laugh, for Sophie's voice echoing through the rooms. My body had grown used to the rhythm of their lives. Now that rhythm was gone. I thought I might feel relief, but instead a sharp ache filled the emptiness. I was invisible in my house, yes, but I was still surrounded by people. Here I was just alone. I reached for my phone. The screen lit up in the dark, casting a faint glow on my face. No calls, no messages. Not a single word from Daniel or Sophie. A part of me had expected panic, some sign that they noticed I was gone. Instead, there was nothing. I opened the gallery, scrolling through old pictures, birthdays where I baked cakes shaped like dinosaurs, Christmas mornings with Daniel's eyes wide at the sight of presents, photos of him at graduations, me always behind the camera, capturing the moment but rarely captured myself. And then later, pictures Sophie had taken, where she was always perfectly posed with wine glasses I had polished, at tables I had set. I was the one holding the frame, never the one inside it. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. If I started crying, I feared I might never stop. I set the phone down and pulled the blanket tighter, though it barely covered me. I told myself this was temporary, just a step I had to take. Tomorrow, I would figure out what came next. The morning light slipped through the thin curtains too early. I woke with a stiff neck, my body unused to the cheap mattress. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and listened. The motel was alive in its own way. Doors slammed down the hall, a couple argued near the parking lot, a baby cried faintly in the next room. Life continued around me, strangers moving through their routines, unaware that my entire world had shifted. I made myself instant coffee from the little packets left on the counter. It tasted like cardboard, bitter even with the powdered creamer. I sipped it slowly, staring out the window at the parking lot. A man loaded suitcases into the trunk of a car. A woman in a faded sweatshirt smoked a cigarette, her eyes distant. Everyone seemed to carry their own burdens, their own invisible stories. For the first time in a long time, I realized mine was not unique. I pulled out my notebook, the one I had tucked into the suitcase almost without thinking. It was the same kind I used to buy for Daniel when he was a boy, spiral-bound, with lined pages waiting to be filled. I opened it to the first page and stared at the blank paper. My pen hovered for a long moment before I began to write. Not a diary, not this time. This was not about pouring feelings onto a page. This was about remembering facts, dates, numbers, receipts. I wrote down every bill I had paid, every grocery trip I had covered, every dollar that had kept that house running. My handwriting shook at first but steadied as I went on. Line after line, I built the record of a life no one else had cared to acknowledge. When I closed the notebook hours later, my hand cramped, I felt something different. Not sadness, not anger, something sharper. Clarity. The second day passed much like the first. I stayed quiet, stayed hidden. I walked down the street to a diner for a sandwich, the kind of place with chipped mugs and waitresses who call everyone honey. I sat in the booth by the window, watching cars pass, and ate slowly, savoring the simple act of being served instead of serving. Still, when I returned to the motel, my phone was silent. No missed calls, no frantic messages. Daniel had not noticed. Sophie had not cared. The ache in my chest deepened, but I did not let it crush me. Instead, I leaned into the silence. By the third night, something inside me shifted. I was no longer waiting for my phone to light up. I was no longer refreshing the screen every hour. I began to realize that their silence spoke louder than any words could. To them, I was disposable. Useful, yes, but not missed. I sat at the desk in the corner of the room, the lamp buzzing faintly, and opened the notebook again. This time, I flipped to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote in bold letters, MY House. Underneath, I wrote my name, the one printed on the deed I had slipped into my suitcase. I stared at it for a long time, my chest rising and falling slowly. It was a reminder, a truth I had almost forgotten. The walls they lived behind, the roof that sheltered them, the space they claimed as theirs, it was mine. For too long, I had let them live as though I was a guest in my own home, but the paper said otherwise. I pressed the pen harder against the page, carving the words into the paper as if to etch them into my memory. This is mine. The silence of the room no longer felt heavy. It felt powerful. I closed the notebook and sat back, my heart steady. I did not know exactly what I would do next, but for the first time, I knew I held something they had forgotten, something they would soon remember. I was not just leaving to escape. I was leaving to reclaim. The days that followed slipped past in a haze, yet each moment etched itself into me like a scar. I had never lived alone before. Even when Daniel was little, even in the hardest years when his father was gone and I was juggling 2 jobs, there had always been the noise of someone else in the house. His footsteps running down the hallway, his voice calling for me, his laughter, even his teenage sulks that filled the rooms with heavy silence. There had always been someone. Now it was just me. The motel room became both a refuge and a cage. The walls were beige, blank, indifferent to my presence. The bedspread was patterned with tiny squares that repeated endlessly, a dizzying reminder of how small the world could feel. I tried to create routines, coffee in the morning, a short walk to the corner store, notes written in my notebook, but the days felt slippery, refusing to hold their shape. On the 4th morning, I woke early and sat by the window, watching the parking lot come alive. Cars started, doors slammed, people moved quickly toward their lives. I watched a woman in a neat suit climb into a sedan, her phone pressed to her ear. A man carried a duffel bag to his truck, his shoulders hunched as if the weight was more than just physical. Everyone seemed to be heading somewhere. I, on the other hand, had nowhere to go. That thought should have frightened me. Instead, it felt strangely freeing. For the first time in years, I had no one to serve, no schedule dictated by someone else's needs. The silence around me was mine. Still, my phone remained stubbornly quiet. Daniel had not called. Sophie had not texted. The emptiness of that silence dug into me, deeper than I cared to admit. I found myself wondering if they had even noticed I was gone. Had Sophie simply opened the refrigerator, found it empty, and shrugged? Had Daniel walked into the kitchen, expecting coffee, and then turned back to his phone when it was not there? By the 5th day, the weight of their absence pressed harder. I could not stop thinking about the house. My house. I imagined Sophie filming one of her wellness videos in the living room, her voice chirping about positivity, while the sink piled high with dishes I was no longer washing. I pictured Daniel sitting on the couch, scrolling through job listings he would not apply for, too paralyzed by pride or fear. I saw them moving through the house as if it was theirs, unaware of the foundation beneath them shifting. That thought gave me an odd sense of comfort. Because I knew something they had forgotten. Legally, the house was still mine. It was almost laughable. All those months, maybe years, of being treated like background, like a servant in the home I had bought, and yet the truth was carved into paper, stamped, and sealed. They could redecorate, they could rearrange, they could post photos to make it look like theirs, but the ground beneath their feet was mine. I pulled out the folder from my suitcase one morning, spread the papers across the small motel desk. My name appeared again and again, bold and certain. The mortgage, the title, the insurance, all of it tied back to me. They had never even bothered to ask for changes, perhaps assuming I would always be there, always keeping things steady. As I traced the letters of my name with my fingertip, I felt something inside me settle. I was not powerless. I had let them make me small, yes, but the truth was still in my hands. That day I walked to the library. The building was quiet, its air cool and faintly musty with the smell of old paper. I found a corner table near an outlet, plugged in my old laptop, and began to search. County records, property documents, anything that reminded me of what I still controlled. It was not revenge that guided me. It was survival. It was dignity. Hours passed as I clicked through page after page, my eyes scanning numbers and dates. I scribbled notes in my notebook, building a case not against them, but for myself. The more I wrote, the more I realized how long I had been carrying them. Groceries, bills, electricity, water, all of it came from me. Every receipt told a story they had ignored. By the time I left the library, the sun had dipped low in the sky. The air smelled of cut grass and asphalt. I walked back to the motel with my notebook heavy in my bag, but my steps lighter than they had been in years. That evening, as I sat on the bed eating takeout noodles from a paper box, my phone finally buzzed. The sound startled me. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The screen lit up, a text from Daniel. "Hey Mom, are you okay? Haven't seen you around." That was all. No question of where I was. No words about missing me. Just a casual line as if I were running late for an appointment. I stared at the message for a long time. My chest tightened, my throat burned. Part of me wanted to reply, to tell him everything, to pour out all the hurt I had swallowed. But another part of me knew that nothing I could say would change the truth. He had only noticed because things were harder without me. I set the phone down without answering. I finished my noodles slowly, the flavor dull in my mouth, and turned off the light. For the first time in years, I let the silence answer for me. The morning after Daniel's message, I woke earlier than usual. The motel room was washed in pale light, and for a moment I simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner. My phone sat on the nightstand. I resisted the urge to reach for it immediately, telling myself I would not start the day waiting for someone else to remember me. When I finally looked, there were no new messages. Not from Daniel, not from Sophie. I brewed the little packet of motel coffee again, the bitter taste familiar now, almost comforting. Sitting at the small table by the window, I watched the parking lot stir to life. A delivery truck backed in with a screech of brakes, a man carried boxes into the lobby. I wondered how many of these strangers had stories like mine, people who had given everything, only to find themselves erased. Later that day, another message came, this time from Sophie. "Hi Cheryl. Not sure if you're feeling well, but we could really use your help around the house. Things are a little crazy right now. Let us know when you're coming back, your help." I read the words 3 times, each repetition hitting harder. Not your presence, not your company, not we miss you, just your help. As though I were a housekeeper who had stepped out for a break and was expected to clock back in, I laughed out loud, the sound sharp and unfamiliar. It surprised me, almost frightened me. I could not remember the last time I had laughed, and certainly not like that. It wasn't joy. It was something bitter, almost jagged, cutting its way out of me. I set the phone down without replying. Instead, I walked back to the library that afternoon. I found the same quiet corner, opened my laptop, and searched again through property records. I needed the confirmation, the reassurance that my name was still there, bold and unshakable. And it was Melody West, owner, no transfer, no joint title. Mine. It struck me then how completely they had forgotten this truth. They had decorated, rearranged, filled the space with their things, and yet the foundation had always been mine. They had built their lives on the illusion that I would never leave, never resist, never remember who I was. But I remembered now. That evening, the motel room felt different. The same scratchy blanket, the same buzzing lamp, but beneath it all, a steady pulse of power hummed in me. I sat at the desk, notebook open, pen in hand, and began to map out my life with new eyes. Not just the past, but possibilities for the future. The next day, Daniel called. His name lit up my screen, and for a moment my heart clenched. I let it ring. His voice went to voicemail, casual, as though nothing was really wrong. "Hey Mom, just wondering where you've been. Ashley's a little stressed. Things have been kind of busy around here without you. Give me a call, okay? Busy without you." Like I was a missing appliance, like the vacuum had broken and he was waiting for repairs. Not once did he say we miss you. Not once did he say I'm worried. I played the message twice, then deleted it. By the 4th day, the tone shifted. Sophie's messages grew more urgent. Cheryl, we really need you back. The kitchen is a mess. The laundry is piling up. Daniel's stressed with work. Please just let us know what's going on. You can't just leave like this. You can't just leave like this. The entitlement of it sank into me like a stone. They had never thought I might leave. They had assumed my role was permanent, my silence guaranteed. To them, my existence was a service, not a choice. I did not reply. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea from the kettle I had bought at a thrift store down the road. The tea was weak, but it tasted like independence. I sat at the desk with my notebook, turning pages filled with receipts and records, and I felt the shape of something forming. A plan. By the end of the week, I no longer jumped when the phone buzzed. Messages came and went, each one a little sharper, a little more desperate. Daniel said I was being childish. Sophie said I was unfair. They accused me of hurting the people who loved me, but their words bounced off me like rain on glass, because I knew the truth. Love had not been what they gave me. Love had not been eating alone in the kitchen, serving meals without a chair of my own. Love had not been silence at the table, indifference in the hallways. They had not loved me. They had used me. And now, without me, their carefully curated lives were starting to fray. At the library, I began searching beyond property records. I looked up credit histories, business registrations. Sophie's coaching business was smoke and mirrors, built on borrowed quotes and staged photographs. Daniel had not been employed for months. Their lives, so full of performance and presentation, were hollow beneath the surface. I sat back in the library chair, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off my glasses, and let the truth sink in. All along, I had been their foundation. Without me, without my work, my money, my silence, their world would crumble. And maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. That night, I returned to the motel, turned off my phone, and placed it face down on the table. The silence did not scare me anymore. It steadied me. For the first time in years, I was not waiting to be invited back into someone else's life. I was building my own. By the time a full week had passed, I no longer woke with dread. The motel room still smelled faintly of bleach, the carpet still rough beneath my toes, but something inside me had shifted. The emptiness no longer pressed against me. Instead, it opened space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to see. Each morning, I walked to the diner down the road. The waitresses had begun to recognize me. They greeted me with tired but kind smiles, slid a cup of coffee onto the counter before I even ordered. Sometimes they asked nothing at all, as if they understood that some people just needed a place to sit quietly, to exist without being questioned. I found comfort in that. I could sit there for an hour, notebook open, pen moving across the page, while the world around me buzzed with conversations I was not part of. For once, being left alone felt like a gift. One afternoon, I took a longer walk. The streets led me toward the edges of my old neighborhood. From a distance, I could see the roof of my house rising above the trees, its lines still familiar, etched into my memory. I stopped at the corner, my suitcase handle clutched in my hand though I wasn't traveling anywhere. Through the leaves, I could make out the faint shimmer of Sophie's wind chimes, the ones she had hung near the porch. They tinkled in the breeze, delicate and artificial. For a moment, I thought about walking up the path, unlocking the door, stepping inside as though nothing had changed. But I stayed where I was, my feet rooted. From that distance, I could see things differently. The house no longer felt like a prison. It looked like what it truly was, mine, not theirs, and if I chose to return, it would be on my terms. That evening back at the motel, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophie, longer this time. Cheryl, this isn't funny anymore. Daniel is worried sick. The bills are piling up. We don't know where you went, but you can't just abandon us like this. Please come back. Abandon us. I read the words slowly, letting them sink in. It amazed me how quickly they had flipped the story. For years, I had been the one abandoned in plain sight, overlooked at the dinner table, erased in the very home I built. Now, because I had stepped away, they were the abandoned ones. I almost smiled. I didn't reply. Instead, I powered the phone off and slid it into the drawer of the motel nightstand. The silence that followed was thick but not suffocating. It was a silence I chose. The next morning, I returned to the library. I requested old financial records, traced Daniel's failed job applications, Sophie's shaky business filings. What I found confirmed what I already suspected. Their lives were unstable, a tower built on air. Without me quietly holding the ground beneath them, they had nothing steady. I sat back in the library chair, my fingers pressed to my lips. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in my mind like a puzzle. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten what I had given, but paper remembers. Records remember. That night in the motel, I spread the papers across the bed. Deeds, receipts, copies of unpaid bills. I traced my finger over the bold letters of my name again and again. Melody West, owner, mother, provider. The one who had been invisible until she chose to step out of the shadows. A plan began to form, not a loud one, not dramatic. Quiet, steady, inevitable. The irony struck me then. For years, they had made me feel like a guest in my own home. Now they were the guests, temporary, replaceable. The truth was simple, I did not need them, but they desperately needed me. As I lay back on the thin mattress, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner, I closed my eyes with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. They had underestimated me. That was their mistake. And soon, they would learn exactly who I still was. The days bled into each other, but instead of feeling lost, I began to find rhythm. My mornings belonged to me. Coffee at the diner, notebook spread open, pen scratching against paper while the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversations filled the background. Afternoons I spent at the library, piecing together fragments of information, following the threads of Daniel and Sophie's fragile lives. Evenings were for quiet reflection, the motel room my cocoon where silence grew into strength. By the second week, I no longer thought of myself as hiding. I was watching, observing, gathering. One afternoon, curiosity pulled me back toward the neighborhood again. I walked slowly, my feet heavy with both dread and determination. When I turned the corner, the house came into view. My house. From the outside, it looked unchanged, its pale siding glowing in the afternoon sun. The garden, though, told the truth. Weeds tangled across the flower beds, grass stretched too long, leaves gathered against the porch steps. The kind of small neglect that spreads when no one cares to tend it. I lingered across the street, half hidden beneath a tree. Through the window, I saw Sophie pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. She moved quickly, her gestures sharp, her face tight with frustration. Daniel sat slouched on the couch, shoulders heavy, his hand running through his hair as though he had been doing it all day. The sight stirred something in me, not pity, not anger, but recognition. They were unraveling without me. It wasn't just the chores. It was the weight of real life pressing down. Bills, groceries, the maintenance of a home, all the invisible threads I had carried for years, now snapping one by one in my absence. I turned away before they could see me. My heart thudded, but not with fear, with certainty. That night back at the motel, I allowed myself a small ritual. I lit a cheap candle I had bought from the dollar store, set it on the desk, and laid out my papers around it. The flame flickered over the deed, over the receipts, over the notes I had scribbled. It was like looking at a map of my life, every line pointing back to me. I whispered into the quiet as if confessing to the walls. This is mine. The words settled into me like an anchor. Days later, the tone of the messages on my phone shifted again. Sophie's polite pleas turned to accusations. Cheryl, this is ridiculous. You're punishing us. We've done nothing wrong. Daniel is exhausted. We can't live like this. Can't live like this. I almost laughed again, the sound low, bitter. For years, I had lived in silence, invisible at my own table, eating scraps in the kitchen while they laughed together. They had never once asked how I lived. And now, 2 weeks without me, their world was collapsing. Daniel's messages followed, shorter, sharper. Mom, you can't just walk away. We need you. Stop being stubborn. Need you. Not love you, not miss you, just need you. I powered the phone off again, slid it beneath my pillow, and closed my eyes. The quiet returned, steady and warm. By the third week, my notebook was nearly full. Page after page of evidence, reminders, records. I wasn't planning for a fight, not yet. I was simply building truth brick by brick until it formed a wall no one could ignore. At the diner, the waitress with tired eyes noticed my notes one morning. Working on something big? She asked with a smile. I hesitated, then nodded. Something like that. She topped off my coffee without asking, her kindness simple, unburdened. I realized how rare that felt, how little I had allowed myself to accept kindness that asked for nothing in return. That night, lying in the motel bed, I thought about the years I had lost. The versions of myself I had buried under service, under silence, under invisibility. And I promised myself I would not go back. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. The irony was not lost on me. They believed I had abandoned them. But in truth, I was the one who had been abandoned long ago. Now, for the first time, I had stepped away not in surrender, but in strength. And though Daniel and Sophie did not know it yet, the foundation of their lives was already shifting beneath them, because I was no longer holding it up. By the time the third week stretched into the fourth, I could feel the shift. The silence that had once scared me had become my companion. The motel room no longer felt like a cage but a base, a place where I could rest and sharpen myself. Every day I grew a little steadier. Every day I felt a little less invisible. Daniel and Sophie's messages had become a rhythm of their own. First polite, then desperate, now sharp with blame. Each notification buzzed against the nightstand, their words pressing harder as if they could force me back into the shape I once fit. "Mom, this isn't fair. We're drowning here." "Cheryl, how could you do this to us? Please, just come home." I read them, sometimes twice, sometimes not at all. Then I set the phone aside. Because beneath every message was the same truth. They were not missing me. They were missing what I did for them. It was strange, realizing how quickly a life can unravel. In the library, I dug deeper, scanning public records, following trails I had ignored for too long. I discovered late fees on utility accounts, notices of missed payments. I read posts Sophie had made on her social media, bright and polished, telling the world how perfect her life was. But the cracks showed through. Photos carefully staged to hide the mess behind her. Motivational captions masking desperation. One night, curiosity pulled me back to the neighborhood again. I stood at the corner, half hidden in the shadows, watching my house from a distance. The porch light flickered unsteady, a bulb that should have been changed weeks ago. The lawn was patchy, the weeds worse than before. I could almost hear the exhaustion in the air. Through the window, I caught glimpses. Sophie slamming a cupboard door. Daniel pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice raised in frustration. Their movements were sharp, frantic, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I stepped back into the shadows before they could notice me. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from clarity. This was the life they had built without me, and it was crumbling. Back in the motel that night, I spread my notes across the bed. The papers formed a mosaic of truth: receipts, deeds, unpaid bills, records of everything I had carried. For years, I had been the invisible foundation. Now, without me, the cracks widened. I thought about calling Daniel, about telling him I was watching, that I knew more than he thought. But I didn't. Silence was louder than words. Silence forced them to face what they had ignored. The next day, my phone rang again. Daniel this time, his voice spilling through the voicemail when I let it go unanswered. "Mom, please, we need you. Sophie is falling apart. I can't do this alone." Alone. The word lingered with me long after the message ended. For years, I had whispered that word to myself in the kitchen, at the table, in my own bed. Alone, even when the house was full. Now he said it as if it was a curse, a weight he could not bear. He was only beginning to taste what I had swallowed for years. I almost pitied him. Almost. That evening, I walked further than before, through streets I hadn't seen in months. The world felt different outside the bubble of my old life. I passed shops with glowing windows, families laughing in restaurants, couples walking hand in hand. I realized how small my world had become when I was trapped in that house, how much of myself I had buried. At a second-hand bookstore, I stopped. The smell of old paper wrapped around me as I stepped inside. Rows of worn spines, cracked covers, stories waiting to be rediscovered. I ran my fingers across the shelves and chose a book almost at random. That night, back in the motel, I read until my eyes blurred. It felt indulgent, selfish even, to do something only for me, but it also felt necessary. Meanwhile, the messages kept coming. Sophie's tone shifted from anger to pleading. "Cheryl, I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family. We need each other. Please, just talk to us." Family. The word cut sharper than she intended, because family does not let someone fade into silence. Family does not use someone until they disappear. I closed the message and turned the phone face down. By the end of the 4th week, the motel had become something else entirely. It was not home, but it was mine. Mine in a way the house hadn't been for years. I decided then that I would not return as the same woman who had left. If I returned, it would not be to serve. It would be to reclaim. I stood at the window one night, staring at the faint glow of streetlights in the parking lot. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, lined with age, eyes tired but steady. For the first time, I didn't look like someone fading. I looked like someone waiting. And deep inside, I knew they had no idea what was coming. The motel walls had become familiar, but I never forgot they were temporary. Each day, I carried the weight of the deed in my suitcase, as though its presence alone reminded me who I was. Every time I touched the folder, I felt steadier. Every time I saw my name in black ink, I felt less like a shadow and more like a force waiting to step into the light. The messages from Daniel and Sophie grew louder in their desperation. "Mom, the bank keeps calling. I don't know what's going on. Can you fix this? Cheryl, this is serious. The electric bill is overdue. I thought you had handled it. Please, just come back. We can't do this without you." That last line made me laugh bitterly. They had never said it out loud before, but it had always been true. They couldn't do it without me. Not then, not now, but I wasn't rushing back. I let the silence sit between us, widening into something they couldn't cross. One evening, I walked again to the edge of the neighborhood. This time, I didn't stop at the corner. My steps carried me closer until I stood across the street from the house. The lights glowed inside, but the atmosphere was different. The curtains hung uneven, one corner slipping off its hook. The porch light was still broken, flickering weakly like a heartbeat about to fail. Through the window, I saw them. Daniel sat hunched over the table, his head in his hands, papers scattered in front of him. Sophie stood nearby, arms crossed, her face tight with anger. They were arguing, though I couldn't hear the words. Their gestures told the story well enough. Accusations, defenses, the walls of their perfect picture cracking open. I watched longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to step forward, to open the door and remind them whose house they were unraveling in. But I didn't. Not yet. Timing mattered. If I returned too soon, they would cling to their illusions. They needed to feel the weight of reality fully before the truth could land. I turned back into the shadows and walked away, my steps lighter than when I came. That night at the motel, I began to test something new. I drafted a letter, not to send, not yet, but to shape the words I might one day deliver. I wrote in careful strokes, each sentence deliberate. Not an apology, not a plea, a statement. This house is mine. I am not your servant. I am not invisible. You lived in comfort because of me, and without me you cannot. Reading it aloud, I heard strength in my own voice, a tone I had not heard in years. The next morning, I returned to the library. I printed copies of every relevant document, the deed, the mortgage, even the insurance in my name. I slipped them into a folder, neat and orderly, the proof of my existence bound in paper. Holding it, I felt like I was holding armor. Meanwhile, the messages from Sophie shifted tone again. "Cheryl, please, we'll do better, we'll include you. Just tell us what you want." It almost made me laugh, the sudden change from command to concession, but I didn't reply. Let them sit in that silence, let them realize that words were not enough. That evening, I sat on the edge of the motel bed, candle burning low, papers spread around me. I closed my eyes and imagined walking through the front door again, not as the quiet shadow I once was, but as the woman whose name still owned every wall. I pictured Sophie's face tightening, Daniel's eyes wide, the silence that would fall when they realized what they had forgotten. I opened my eyes and smiled. For years, I had been erased in my own home, but soon I would step back into it. Not erased, not invisible, seen, and when I did, nothing would be the same. The morning I decided to return, the air felt heavier than usual. I woke before dawn in the motel, staring at the ceiling, my heart steady but alive with a current of energy I had not felt in years. The decision wasn't sudden. It had been building in me, day after day, message after message, paper after paper. But that morning, it crystallized. I folded my clothes carefully into the suitcase, slid the folder of documents on top, and zipped it closed. My hand lingered on the zipper, the sound of it sharp in the quiet room. I had arrived here weeks ago with trembling hands, unsure of myself, unsure of anything. Now I left with certainty. The drive to the neighborhood was quiet. The streets looked the same, lined with trees that had started to shed their leaves. The world outside carried on, ordinary and unknowing, while inside my chest, a storm brewed. When I turned the corner and the house came into view, my breath caught. My house. Its roof gleamed faintly in the pale morning light, but closer inspection revealed the truth. The lawn was unkempt, the porch sagged with neglect, the curtains hung uneven. They had not cared for it the way I always had. I parked at the curb and sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. My heart thudded, but not with fear, with anticipation. I wasn't a guest knocking at their door. I wasn't someone asking permission. I was the owner returning to what was mine. I stepped out, suitcase in hand, and walked up the path. The weeds brushed against my ankles. The porch creaked beneath my weight. When I reached the door, I pulled my keys from my pocket. The same keys I had always carried, the ones I had never given up. The lock clicked easily. The sound echoed in my chest. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of meals left unfinished and laundry left undone. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes sweeping over the space that once held my life. Shoes scattered by the door, dishes stacked in the sink, clothes draped carelessly across the banister. For a moment, I stood there in silence, letting the reality settle in. This was what my absence had revealed. Without me, the order had collapsed. Then I heard footsteps above me. A door opened and Sophie's voice rang out, sharp and groggy. "Daniel, did you leave the door unlocked again?" She appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair messy, her robe hanging loose. When her eyes landed on me, she froze. The color drained from her face. "Cheryl," she whispered, her voice thin. I didn't move. Good morning, Sophie. My tone was calm, steady. She gripped the railing, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. Finally, she managed. You came back. Yes, I said simply. I came back. Daniel appeared behind her, his hair sticking up, his face drawn with exhaustion. When he saw me, his jaw clenched. Mom, he said, the word heavy, almost accusing. Where have you been? I set the suitcase down by the door. Out, I answered. Away. His eyes flickered to the suitcase, then back to me. You can't just disappear like that. We've been struggling. I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. Yes, I know. The silence that followed was thick. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting in the fabric of her robe. Daniel's face hardened. You could have told us, he muttered. I stepped further into the hallway, my eyes locking on his. And you could have seen me. Years, Daniel, years I was right here, invisible in front of you, and you never looked. His mouth opened, but no words came. I walked past them into the living room. The space looked smaller than I remembered, cluttered with things that didn't belong. Sophie's candles lined the shelves, her throw blankets draped over the couch, her prints hanging crookedly on the walls. But beneath it all, I saw my house, my furniture, my walls. I turned to face them. They hovered at the edge of the room, uncertain, as though I were a stranger who had trespassed. I think you've forgotten something, I said softly. I pulled the folder from my suitcase, placed it on the coffee table, and opened it. The papers spread like a fan, black ink against white, each page carrying my name. House, these walls, this foundation, it's mine. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel's eyes darted across the documents, his face pale. I let you live here, I continued, my voice rising with each word. I welcomed you, I carried you, and you repaid me with silence, with erasure, with laughter at tables where I had no seat. The room was silent except for the sound of my breathing. Daniel finally spoke, his voice shaking. Mom, we didn't mean? No, I said, cutting him off. You didn't think. You didn't see, and now you will. The words hung between us like thunder, filling every corner of the room. For the first time in years, I wasn't the invisible figure in the background. I was the center, and they couldn't look away. The silence that followed my words seemed to stretch forever. Sophie stood near the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could shield her body from the weight of my presence. Daniel sat down heavily on the couch, his eyes darting between the papers on the table and my face. This isn't fair, Sophie said at last, her voice trembling. We thought, I cut her off. You thought wrong. You thought this house was yours because you redecorated, because you hung your curtains and scattered your things across the rooms. But paint and candles don't change the foundation. You thought my silence meant I didn't exist, but silence is not absence. It is choice. And now my choice has changed. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, his voice low. Why now, Mom? Why after everything? After everything? I repeated, my voice sharp. I stepped closer, forcing him to meet my eyes. After nights spent standing in the kitchen while you laughed at a table I set. After mornings when the coffee brewed itself, the laundry folded itself, the bills paid themselves because you never noticed the hands that did it. After years of being erased in the house I built. That's what you mean by everything. He flinched but didn't answer. Sophie shifted her weight, her face pinched with frustration. We never asked you to do all that. You chose to. The words lit a fire in me. I slammed my palm against the folder, the papers rustling like wings. I chose to love my son. I chose to keep this roof over his head. I chose to carry the weight so he could walk lighter. But love is not the same as servitude. And you, Sophie, have mistaken one for the other. Her mouth opened, but the words caught in her throat. I straightened, my voice calm now, almost quiet. I am not your maid. I am not your safety net. I am not invisible. I tapped the papers with one finger, slow and deliberate. I am the owner of this house, and I am done being erased. Daniel buried his face in his hands, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked small, fragile. I didn't mean to, his voice cracked. I thought you were fine. I thought you didn't mind. I felt something inside me soften for just a moment, the echo of the boy he used to be, the child who once clung to my hand at the beach, who once looked at me as if I were his entire world. But then I remembered the years of silence, the meals eaten alone, the way his eyes had slid past me as though I were furniture. You didn't think, I said gently, but firmly. And that is the problem. The air in the room was heavy, each of us breathing carefully, as though the walls themselves were listening. Finally, I bent down, gathering the papers into a neat stack and slipped them back into the folder. I tucked it beneath my arm and lifted the suitcase from the floor. I am staying, I said simply. Sophie blinked. What? You heard me. I set the suitcase against the wall. This is my house. If you wish to stay, you will stay as guests, and guests do not treat the owner as invisible. Her face flushed, her mouth tightening. You can't just change the rules like this. I met her eyes steadily. The rules were always mine, you just ignored them. Daniel looked up at me, his face pale. Mom, please don't do this, we'll figure it out, we'll do better. I shook my head. Words are not enough. Actions will prove the truth. Until then, this is no longer your stage, it is my home. I turned, walked toward the staircase, and placed my hand on the banister. The wood was smooth beneath my palm, worn by years of touch, mine, Daniel's, even Sophie's, but it was mine first. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel their eyes on me. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. They were stunned, silenced, forced to see what they had refused to see for so long. When I reached the landing, I paused, glancing back down at them. My voice carried through the stillness. You forgot who I was, but I have remembered, and now you will too. With that, I walked into my room, closed the door behind me, and let the silence settle over the house like a storm waiting to break. For the first time in years, I felt the walls breathe with me again, and I knew the balance had shifted. The morning after my return was strangely quiet. I woke in my old room, the pale light spilling through curtains Sophie had chosen. They were too thin, too sheer, but I didn't mind. The light felt different now. It felt like proof that I was still here. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The house creaked in its familiar ways, the pipes groaning, the floor settling, but beneath it all I heard something new, hesitation. Daniel and Sophie moved through the house like strangers in someone else's home. Their voices were low, their steps uncertain. For once, they were the ones who felt out of place. I opened my suitcase, pulled out the folder, and placed it on the nightstand. My armor. My truth. Downstairs, I could smell coffee brewing. Not the way I made it, too weak, almost watery, but the scent pulled me down anyway. When I entered the kitchen, Sophie was there in her robe, her back stiff as she poured the coffee into mugs. Daniel sat at the table, staring at his phone, his face pale and drawn. They both froze when they saw me. Morning, I said, my voice calm. Neither answered at first. Sophie cleared her throat. We didn't know if you'd want coffee. I'll pour my own, I replied. I reached for the pot, filled a mug, and sat across from Daniel. The silence stretched. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice rough. Mom, what's happening here? Are you throwing us out? I sipped my coffee slowly before answering. I'm not throwing anyone, I'm reclaiming, there's a difference. Sophie leaned forward, her voice sharp. You can't just decide this overnight, we've been living here for years. I met her gaze evenly. Living, yes. Owning, no. You confused comfort with control. You thought my silence was surrender, but the papers tell a different story. Her face flushed and she looked away. Daniel rubbed his forehead, groaning softly. We don't have anywhere else to go, he admitted. The honesty in his voice pulled at something inside me, but I held steady. That's not my fault, I said quietly. For years, I gave you stability. You chose not to build your own. The weight of my words pressed into the room. Sophie's eyes darted to Daniel, searching for support, but he had none to give. After breakfast, I wandered through the house, reacquainting myself with every corner. The living room was cluttered with Sophie's trinkets, candles burned halfway down, books stacked carelessly. The dining table still bore faint stains from dinners I had prepared. Upstairs, their bedroom door was ajar, revealing piles of laundry spilling across the floor. My house looked neglected, tired, but beneath the chaos, I could still feel its bones, strong, steady, mine. Later that afternoon, I sat in the living room with the folder open on my lap. Daniel stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. Mom, he said, his voice low, can we work this out, without all this? He gestured to the papers, his face pale. I looked up at him, my son, the boy who once clung to me and now could barely meet my eyes. Work this out. Daniel, I spent years working it out, alone, while you sat at that table and laughed. His lips pressed together, his shoulders sagging. I didn't see it. No, I said softly. You didn't want to. Sophie appeared behind him, arms crossed. So what's your plan, Cheryl? You want us to serve you now? You want us to grovel? I closed the folder and placed it on the coffee table. I don't want servants. I want recognition. I want respect. I want the truth to be seen for what it is. The silence that followed was sharper than shouting. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had led here, the dinners where I had no seat, the nights spent eating scraps, the mornings spent cleaning for others. And now the house breathed differently. The walls no longer pressed in on me. They opened, wide and steady, reminding me of who I was, but beneath that calm, another thought stirred. This wasn't just about living here again. This was about something bigger. I reached for the folder, opened it, and traced my name across the deed. Melody West. Clear, certain, undeniable. A plan sharpened in my mind, one final step that would leave no doubt. Daniel and Sophie thought this was a fight over chores, over space, over comfort. They had no idea how much deeper it went. And soon they would learn. The days that followed felt like standing in the eye of a storm. The air in the house was heavy, charged with tension. Daniel and Sophie moved around me as though I were a shadow they could not ignore anymore. Their voices were softer, their steps slower. For years, I had been invisible. Now my presence filled every room. I let them sit with it. Silence had always been my burden, now it was my weapon. On the third evening, Daniel finally broke. We were in the kitchen. I was slicing an apple, steady, deliberate. He leaned against the counter, his arms folded, his face pale with exhaustion. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "Can't keep going like this." I looked up. "Like what?" Like we're your guests, like we're intruders in our own home." I set the knife down, met his eyes. "It is not your home, Daniel, that's the point, it never was." He flinched, the truth striking sharper than the blade on the counter. Sophie entered then, her voice rising to fill the silence. "So what, Cheryl? What's your end game here? You get to sit on your throne while we serve you? Is that it?" I wiped my hands on a towel, calm, unhurried. "No, my end game is honesty. My end game is remembering who built this house, who carried it, who owns it. And my end game," I paused, letting my voice cut through the air, "is choice, something you never gave me." Her mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer. I walked into the living room, motioning for them to follow. The folder waited on the coffee table, its papers neat, precise. I opened it slowly, spread the documents once more. The deed, the mortgage, the insurance, all in my name. Daniel sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. Sophie stood stiffly by the doorway, her arms crossed, her jaw clenched. "You see these?" I asked, tapping the papers. "This is not just about bricks and walls, this is about truth, and the truth is simple, without me you have nothing." Daniel's shoulders trembled. He looked up, his eyes glassy. "So what happens now?" I leaned back in the chair, my voice calm, almost gentle. "What happens now is my choice. I can let you stay here as guests. Or I can sell this house tomorrow and you will be out on the street. The decision rests with me, not you, not Sophie, me." The words hit them like thunder. Sophie's face went pale. Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came. I let the silence linger, heavy and absolute. Then slowly I closed the folder. "For years," I said softly, "I lived as if I had no power. I let myself shrink so you could grow. I let myself be invisible so you could shine. But no more. I am done disappearing. If you stay here, you will see me. If you cannot do that, you will leave." The weight of the moment pressed into the room. Daniel lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, his voice breaking. "I understand." Sophie didn't answer. She turned away, her arms wrapped tight around herself, her silence saying more than words ever could. That night, I sat in my room, the house quiet around me. I thought about everything that had led here, the meals, the scraps, the laughter that excluded me, the silence that erased me. And now the balance was reversed. The twist was not in the papers, not in the deed, not even in the threat of selling the house. The twist was in me. I was no longer the woman who ate standing in the kitchen. I was no longer the mother who let her son's gaze pass through her. I was no longer the shadow. I was Melody West, owner, mother, survivor. And at last, I was visible. As I closed my eyes, I felt the house breathe with me. The walls no longer pressed me into silence. They echoed with my presence, steady and undeniable. The storm had passed, but its mark would remain forever.